There's another delegation, American delegation in Kyiv right now, as you know, headed up by the Secretary of the Army, and included in that are two very senior U.S. four-star generals who understand the situation much better, frankly, than Steve Witkoff. I expect that this delegation will be in close coordination, consultation with the Ukrainians, and they will go over again. There's going to be another proposal.
Now, first this hour, the United States has drafted a 28-point peace plan for Ukraine after secret talks with Russian negotiators. The new proposals reportedly involve the country ceding more territory in the east, with Russia gaining full control of the Donbass region. Donald Trump spoke about ending the war earlier.
8 raging conflicts, 8 wars. I've settled 8 wars. I have 1 to go. You know what that one is. I thought that was going to be my easy one because I have a good relationship with President Putin, but I'm a little disappointed in President Putin right now. He knows that. I thought that was going to be the easy one.
Well, I've been speaking to William B. Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He was also chargé d'affaires to the country. He gave me his thoughts on the plans.
It is drawn up by the U.S. and Russians, and mostly, it sounds like, by the Russians. I mean, this is a pretty lopsided proposal that I am pretty sure that the Ukrainians will not be interested in. My bet is the Ukrainians will be polite and thank the Americans for the ideas, but will make a pretty dramatic counter proposal that is much more reasonable as far as the Ukrainians concerned.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at reports on this plan, which are still emerging, and it appears to suggest that Ukraine gives up the remainder of the eastern Donbass region, which has been the subject of intense fighting for so long. Ukraine abandoning key categories of weapons, the rolling back of US military assistance, no foreign troops on Ukrainian soil. What are you understanding? Is that what you're hearing about this plan? Take us through what you've heard.
It is. That you've characterized it well, Carol. And these are all the points that the Russians have been making for 3.5 years. These are the points that Putin has laid out to Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy. And so it shows up. It's kind of surprising that the Russian proposal shows up under the heading of the Americans. This is not an American proposal, I don't think. And I think that this will be very clear that this is not the final proposal that the Ukrainians look at. I mean, you've described it right. This is essentially Ukrainian capitulation to the Russians.
It seems to stipulate that Russian is recognized as an official state language in Ukraine. I mean, how would that be perceived, do you think, by the Ukrainian people?
It'll be dismissed, Carol. It's not serious. It used to be that Ukrainians, most of whom spoke some Russian, some Ukrainians living in the east and the south used to speak only Russian together with their Ukrainian. But now, since the Russians have invaded in 2014 and then invaded big time in 2022, now Russian is the language of the enemy, and Ukrainians do not speak it in public. They may speak it in their homes, but they don't speak it in public because it's the language of the enemy. So this proposal goes nowhere.
When we look at this militarily, do you think it would amount to Ukraine surrendering, at least to an extent?
To a large extent. It is the request by the Russians to the Ukrainians to capitulate, to surrender, to not join NATO, to limit their forces, not take equipment and weapons from the Americans or Europeans, limit the size of their forces. This, again, so lopsided as not to be serious.
We haven't had, of course, any official word from the US yet. Is it your understanding that Steve Witkoff is actually accepting these points and likely to try and push Ukraine to accept them?
He might, but there's another delegation, American delegation in Kyiv right now, as you know, headed up by the Secretary of the Army, and included in that are two very senior U.S. four-star generals who understand the situation much better, frankly, than Steve Witkoff. I expect that this delegation will be in close coordination, consultation with the Ukrainians, and they will go over again. There's going to be another proposal. You know, Carol, I would say it's a good thing that we're having this conversation, that the conversation about an agreement that will stop the fighting, good to have that. This proposal from Witkoff and the Russians is not that. It's not serious. But it is good that they can have this because there is a proposal that the Ukrainians could put on the table with the Europeans, by the way. I imagine the Europeans are watching this very closely and probably thinking about phone calls to President Trump on this one. But the Ukrainians will come up with a proposal that would stop the fighting, a ceasefire or an armistice that would stop the fighting. That's where they ought to be going.
Do you think that the Ukrainians will now come up with a counter-proposal, will come out perhaps and reject this plan?
Well, Carol, we have some experience with this. The Ukrainians have some experience with this. The Americans came several months ago, back in the spring and early summer, the Americans came with a proposal on a minerals deal between the Americans and the Ukrainians, which was pretty lopsided. The first draft was pretty lopsided. The Ukrainians took a look at it and said, you know, this is not what we're ready to sign up to. We'll give you a counter proposal. So they know how to say no. The Ukrainians know how to say no and to come up with another proposal that is much better, that is much more even-handed. And that actually, the minerals deal came out pretty well. I frankly think that the Ukrainians will hold off and hold out for a much better proposal, a much better outcome than this one is.
President Trump clearly would like to achieve that ambition that he's talked about of ending the war in Ukraine. How great do you think is the risk that he is once again being played by President Putin and could accede to many of his demands?
If he does, he won't get the Peace Prize, Carol. I mean, you don't get a Peace Prize for surrender. That's not a peace. And so a bad deal, and this is a really bad deal, would be worse than no deal. They should walk away from this one if that's what's on the table. But you also point out that President Trump does have a strong motivation and has spent a lot of time on this issue, and his people have spent a lot of time on this issue, phone calls, meetings. And so I expect that he will continue to push for this and push for an outcome that stops the fighting. This proposal will not stop the fighting.
President Zelensky is facing perhaps the biggest challenge domestically since the start of the war. This corruption scandal appears to be touching senior members of his government. There's pressure on him over his close advisor and so on. Do you think that there is a risk here that Russia and perhaps the United States as well will try to use this point of weakness by President Zelensky to force the Ukrainians into something like this kind of plan?
Carol, the Russians clearly will. The Russians absolutely will. That's what they're doing right now. I am confident that the Americans will not. The Americans will look for a just and lasting peace. We've said this over and over. That will stop the war. And that's what President Trump has said over and over, wants to stop the fighting. This proposal doesn't do that. You're right. President Zelensky does have a problem on his hands, which he seems to be dealing with, trying to deal with, and he will have to make some further difficult decisions, as you have indicated. But that will go on, and that's what he knows he has to do that, and that will get him, if he does make these difficult decisions, and he does get rid of people who are the problem. And, you know, they've dealt with corruption for some time. They've got these mechanisms that actually have been working to ferret out corruption. If he allows those to go, supports the investigations, moves through this, then President Zelensky can deal with the domestic problem. But this other one, right now, this proposal from the Russians, he will be very firm.
Well, that was William B. Taylor, former US ambassador to Ukraine. He was also chargé d'affaires for Ukraine in 2019.